II was being fought, it was the one and only thing on Americans' minds. They kept track of the events of the war and were immersed in it every day. Even though the people at home were not fighting, they played a huge role in the outcome of the war. Rationing provided soldiers with the materials necessary to win the war. Rationing means a fair share for all of us.
While American soldiers were fighting World War II across the sea, the citizens at home did their jobs to provide for these soldiers. The food rationing program was set up in 1942 in efforts to control the supply and demand. They took these measures to avoid and prevent the anger of the public. If rationing did not begin, everyday supplies would no longer be on the shelves and prices would need to rise. The program had an immense impact on the course of the war. Americans sacrificed and preserved anything they could to provide enough for the soldiers in Europe. Every little scrap of iron or steel helped the U.S. Army to build tanks, ships, and guns. Objects that were considered garbage were even useful. Pieces of metal and rubber were used for unexpected items like bombs, parachute flares, and tires for jeeps. All the supplies that were rationed and saved by every American were all used in the efforts to win the war. Without the materials created and saved from the rationing program, the U.S. Army would not have been able to keep fighting, and ultimately succeed in winning the war. The program not only created materials for the Army, but created a sort of union between Americans. Many would share their rationing books, and there was a feeling of pride as they worked hard to provide for the men fighting for justice.
Politically, rationing was mainly to help the soldiers fighting the war. To be able to win the war, Americans needed to have a strong military and the proper weapons. Americans were encouraged not to waste materials that could be made into weapons or other war products. The steel industry was pushed to produce to their maximum capacity. The War Production Board said that even one old shovel will help make 4 hand grenades. Scraps of every kind were utilized. Cheese, milk, and fats were rationed from March 1943 to 1945. In rural areas, farmers were able to get their own dairy products from the animals on their farms and therefore were not as affected by this ration as the city dwellers. Their work was crucial for the rest of the country, so they were given extra rations of gasoline to drive their tractors and keep their farms in business. Socially, rationing caused Americans to share with each other. Everybody got the same amount of the same materials, and they tried to help each other whenever possible. Neighbors and family would swap their rations of certain items if they were not wanted. Gasoline was in high demand, so carpooling was heavily encouraged. Cartoons in the newspapers and posters with catchy sayings and tunes were effective in raising awareness of the ration. This comic exaggerates the minuscule amounts of gasoline that Americans were allowed to purchase.
Even though one would think wartime rationing only affected life during the war, some things that were affected by rationing are still popular today, like recycling, food additives, small home gardens, and modernized dress. In World War II, families had to change their way of life because of rationing. To aid the war, the government encouraged the donation of items that could be recycled, like rubber, bottles, cans, paper, cooking fats, and metal, to salvage drives. After the war, we learned that recycling benefits the planet as well and is more popular today than ever. Because food was so limited, artificial additives enhanced food's nutritional content. Food substitutes, like cottage cheese for meat, increased cottage cheese sales from 110 million pounds to 500 million pounds between 1930 and 1944. Today, artificial flavors and additives are in almost everything we eat to benefit our health and decrease shelf life. Families were encouraged to grow victory gardens because produce was in limited supply. 20 million gardens provided Americans with 40% of the country's vegetables in 1945. Today, in order to conserve funds and to receive fresh produce, some families create their own vegetable gardens. Rationing also had a great effect on clothing. Certain materials were needed for the war, like cotton, silk, wool, and linen. New materials like rayon replaced them. Women's clothing changed drastically, becoming shorter and tighter to conserve cloth. Today, our style reflects the clothing produced in the 1940s. Most of the materials we wear are artificial, and women's clothing has continued to become more fitting. Even though today we do not think we are influenced by our past, wartime rationing had a great effect on lives of Americans.